Hello and welcome to the Ohio Arts Council's Rife Gallery programming series for our current show, A Common Thread, curated by Karen Peterson and Shar Norman. Today we are thrilled to present collaborative artists Molly Jo Burke and Nathan Gorgen. As a brief reminder, everyone tuning in today is in listen-only mode, so feel free to utilize that chat function to ask questions. We'll be sure to get to them at the end of the talk. Also, please keep in mind that because we're presenting from separate locations, there might be a variation in bandwidth, so if one of us freezes up or the sound fluctuates, thanks in advance for bearing with us. All right, thanks everyone, and welcome Molly and Nate.
Hi, great to be here.
So we're gonna just jump right in since we only have an hour. So basically, this is we're just gonna introduce ourselves briefly. So my name is Dr. Molly Jo Burke, and I have been an artist for around 20 plus years at this point, and I'm also a parent. So I have two lovely children with this collaborator of mine. And my main background focus in art is three-dimensional work, and I use a lot of glass, but I also use other materials, and I always like to say that my interest is in materials that flow and then freeze. So things like clay and plaster and wax are some of my favorites, but I also sometimes use fabric and fiber. So
My name is Nathan Gorgen, and I've been working as an artist for also about 20 years. My background is in painting and sculpture. Specifically, I also work in digital fabrication, so CNC machines and 3D printers and things like that.
yeah, so we have individual practices and we're going to talk about them very briefly, but we did form a collaborative in 2017 where we started working together on artwork and kind of collaborating. And we joke that our actual first collaboration was in 2016 when we made our first child, but actually the artwork happened about a year later when we're like, we need to get back into doing things. So at this point, Nate's going to talk a little
Yeah,
bit.
so we're going to go over our backgrounds a little bit and the art that we did prior to the collaboration. And you'll see sort of maybe where some of the influences come from for the work that we're doing now. So I started as a painter and then transitioned into painting objects, found objects in this case. I was working with traditional faux finishing techniques as far as paint is concerned. So just sort of interested in like changing the nature of an object by changing its surface or faking it into a more valuable material than it's actually made of to begin with. I also have been working for a long time in art spaces and studios that employ digital fabrication. This is a piece that was made in response to that. Basically, what this is a hunk of wood that has been 3D scanned, and then that scan has been reproduced in a variety of different digital fabrication media, like a laser cutter and a CNC machine. And then the natural original is reflected in the fabricated, computer fabricated like shelf that lies below it.
And this wood is special.
Yeah, that is box elder maple, which has a unique characteristic of, you can see there's some reddish coloring in there. That is an immune response to invasion by bugs or fungus or things like that. So it's just, I think, an interesting, both visually and also kind of metaphorically.
So this is some work that I created in 2014, and it's from a series that I did called, initially the series is called We're Not Broken, and then I kind of moved into this one called Don't Touch Me, which what I see these lovely kind of egg form shapes, which balance very carefully on their heavy weighted bottoms, as are almost like this societal commentary on us as people and like groupings. And they're very interesting forms because they're so smooth and so beautiful, but then they also are very fragile and have the potential to break. But even when they do break, they actually still look kind of lovely and this kind of natural can remind you of eggshells or different things you encounter in nature. And so I think there's something really nice about that kind of coming into the art space and rethinking the size and shape and form of them. The one piece with the orange on the side is what's funny about this is that somebody did actually touch that in the gallery and broke it. So did not read the title very well. These are some forms that I make out of glass. And so this particular series is a reflection on kind of coral reefs and thinking about what's going on with them with the bleaching. And so there's a lot of absence of color in the forms that look like barnacles or little coral parts. And then I was really playing with the kind of this abundance idea where we like in our own what's going on right now with this abundance of different material culture or just in society, like thinking about overwhelming us in a positive and negative way, but playing off of vintage Hollywood colors, kind of thinking about different ways of nostalgia in there. So I really think that there's like a beautiful ugly kind of thing going on with both of our works. And so that's one thing that kind of plays as a theme as we move throughout. So we're going to move into now talking about where we kind of came together. So initially, we gave ourselves like a very specific prompt of working together. And actually, Nate kind of came up with it and applied
Yes.
for a show.
So basically what we've done, or what we started out as doing, is kind of a pass back and forth kind of collaboration technique, where we actually started with some leftover material from my work, which was operating a CNC machine in a student shop, and the students would come in and they would cut out material for their projects, and they would leave behind these plywood sort of skeletons, or these plywood remains. And I was taking those and recycling them into artwork. And so basically what we did was, starting with this kind of canvas of shapes, we then work into it. One person would do an initial pass and then pass it off to the next person to apply a finish or change a color or something like that. And then we would pass it back and forth several times until we felt like it was done.
And so one thing that was kind of interesting is like harnessing components of my practice and his practice, and then also being able to because once you leave graduate school or kind of this education environment, like a lot of times you're not getting critical feedback. And so this created an opportunity for us to give each other feedback and think about our own skill sets and how we could challenge each other to do some things that maybe we thought would be interesting. And so it really helped grow our skill sets in ways that I think have been really positive. So to give you some idea, like there's like these forms that look like they're kind of coming out and undulating out of the plaster form there. Those are actually the broken parts of that piece earlier from Don't Touch Me that like are flat, like convex forms. And so then Nate was faux finishing on top of them. So it becomes this interesting looking marble-like thing that is really a very fun thing to kind of encounter. And then these are left over from other sculptures that I did, and they're like little wax bits. So this is actually a really beautiful large scale piece. It's 42 by 48 inches. And so it has these like cutouts and inclusions kind of happening throughout. And we do like to use materials that are actually not necessarily traditional to being exposed in the gallery space. And so we have polystyrene and the like EPS foam, which is like the insulating foam that you use for your house. So that's actually like this hot, like that kind of purpley color. That one you get from, is this the Menards one?
I think so.
Yeah. So each hardware store has like a color. So the Lowe's is blue.
Yeah, Home Depot is green and Menards is pink.
Yeah, so depending on where you get your foam, that's what you get. And they're actually really lovely colors. So it's kind of been fun to like incorporate that into our practice, like this idea of the home renovation and what you expose and don't expose. We went on to do like several iterations of this passing back and forth play of art making, and had a really wonderful exhibition at Illinois Wesleyan University in 2020. You can see our daughter, our first collaboration running through the space here. Percy was 2.5 or 3. I think she was 3, or about to be 3.
4.
4?
Yeah.
Shh, don't talk about it. But basically it's been interesting to kind of have this work grow and develop at the same time that our family is also, and how we parent and work together changes. Soon we started making work where we were actually including things that we were like dealing with in our daily lives. So it went from being like thinking about nature and our time together to being like, what's with all this stuff?
Yeah.
So
Yeah, as our kids grew older, they started to, accumulate lots of things. I mean, they were accumulating things as babies too, but basically we started to, reach into their sort of drawer of craft supplies or kind of whatever we had on hand for them.
or they're like magpies. I don't
Yeah,
know.
they take and pick up all kinds of little things, and we were just sort of availing ourselves of that material, and this is part of the result of that.
So you can see like pom-poms included from like some sort of like craft kit a family member got them that we had leftover parts, and then we're not allowed to throw them away because that would be like devastating to them. So but then like as we were also working on our own projects around the house, because as artists we're also apparently general contractors, so we were doing some renovations of our 1950s 1948 home that unfortunately, sadly, it turns out that
Needed
it
renovations.
needed some renovations. And so we redid the bathrooms, and from that process, we had all these leftover materials that we were just like, oh, but I still really love this wallpaper and I still have all these things. And so we started to kind of create these themes around like this process of developing that space. And there's lots of little tiny details in here of like little bits of ephemera kind of coming out. We also started, this is like where we first did the vacuum forming. And so this is actually vacuum forming over some of the glass remains that I had from the studio. And so they're actually contained within that painting and held into place. And then we also started to think about started to become more sculptural and less wall-based. And so the works became similarly sized to the objects that you have in your home, either for decoration or for functional use, such as dishes or plates or bowls, vases, but also just like memorabilia. And so Nate created this,
Yeah, so we created this shelf, which is made from live edge material, and we basically have created all these kind of smaller pieces. The idea being that, we can create a lot of different interesting little sort of hand holdable sculptures that can be rearranged to take all different kinds of, create all kinds of different relationships on the work, on the wall, on the shelf.
so essentially allowing like the way you decorate your bookcase or like your home in a way, like with all of these objects that have significance to you, like this is like this kind of play on that within the art space. And so what we were doing is actually going in, dropping off the work or shipping the work, and then leaving the gallery assistants or the curator to actually then arrange the objects in the space. And so to us, it was really interesting to see what arrangements they came up with. And many of the people who worked with us on these projects were actually like, this was so much fun. Like it was so interesting to see how the pieces work together or talk to each other and things like that. So that was really great. And so you can see that there's lots of play within the works and like this kind of like explosion of material. And so what's interesting is like really being able to see the textures kind of come together. And so one of the things that we were doing is like matching to the foam block. Like I had this air dry clay that I was actually color matching to the toy to then make it look like things were growing out of the toy because the color was just right. So essentially stealing my children's art supplies whenever possible. And then also using the silicone, which is something that you typically would be using to reproduce more work or make more things. We actually use it as kind of metaphorically as like a connective tissue. So I kind of see this as almost like the humanity creep, kind of like this like touching and getting to things and like how we interact, or almost like a tissue or a fluid. But it's again, it's kind of that beautiful, ugly situation where it's like, it's kind of beautiful to think of all these interactions and connections we have, but it's also kind of alarming to think about our ability to pollute and destroy. And so it's a, you know, it's fun.
Yeah.
Makes
It's
you
interesting
think,
anyway.
makes you think.
Yeah.
And so again, thinking about the domestic space, some of these forms are very, dinner table sized. So because a lot of your life is centered around eating and doing things together related to food. Some fun facts, the inside of this is actually the bathroom floor of our 1948 home. And so you can see like little chunks of glitter in there.
Yeah, it was removed during the renovation, but it was just much too interesting to get rid of. And I think we had 2 bathrooms that we renovated. One had a green glittery floor and the other one had a pink glittery floor. And I think we still have some of both of that.
Yeah, we do. So we're hoarders. It's fine. Then we started to move more into these dimensional prints. And so, thinking about kind of the Baroque period, whether they're still lifes or portraiture, including like elements still of our artwork and the home renovation components, but actually also starting to throw in like the children's toys and things like that. So, they kind of became this interesting seek and find situation where it's almost like you're looking for what objects pop out at you. And this is something like if you go to the exhibition at the Rife Gallery, you'll see within the sand castings and also the larger sculpture, this continues to play.
Yeah, we use the same technique for a lot of our sculpture from sort of this point forward. Basically what this is we're using a vacuum former, which is a piece of equipment that is traditionally used in sign making, but basically it takes a heated sheet of glass or plastic and basically doesn't melt it, but softens it enough so that when you drop it down on top of the material that's gathered underneath and turn on your vacuum, it sucks all the air out and the material conforms to whatever is underneath it.
Yeah, so this is also, we just put in some of our influences. So I think you can see a lot of layering and stacking in similarity to the compositions of these.
Yeah, and sort of whirling like composition as well.
Some beads in here.
Yeah.
So the interesting thing is this is what it looks like when we're setting up the process. And so it's very chaotic, which I actually love the way these photos look like. And so what I'm using is like kind of taking from my mold making background, I build up the layers in such a way that like once we do the vacuum form, I can pull out these like individual little parts so that the things don't get stuck in there. Because we do have, we do like to be able to potentially make a cast from the actual vacuum form sheet, because the vacuum form pieces will only last like 3 to 5 years before they start to degrade, which is okay with us. Like I do think there's something nice about being ephemeral in that way or temporary. But what is nice is that
you can cast into them with a variety of different materials, plaster, etc. So this is a video of the vacuum forming in process. So you can see above that heated plastic sheet, and then it drops down on top of the material, and flip a lever and all the air is sucked out, which causes basically the pressure of the atmosphere to push the plastic down around all of the stuff underneath it.
And so what's nice is like, you see, even this piece, I was actually able to get out of the vacuum formed sheet. Now we do take this off relatively quickly after we finish it. So it's
the machine or the sheet is still flexible.
Yeah, the sheet is still like relatively flexible at that point. If you wait too long, everything cools down and it becomes very stiff. And so like there is really knowing the timing of everything and how to do it in order to make it function just right. But yeah, it is kind of incredible the amount of detail that you can get with these. Unfortunately, they do not document well with the camera, like, but when you see them in person, they're pretty incredible. So we got to figure out the white on white situation.
Yeah.
So now we have to figure out how to advance, which is always fun. There we
There
go.
we go.
So we moved a little bit from like that trading back and forth with the frames to the vacuum form pieces. And then we also then started to do more planning collaboratively about what we were doing, still harnessing each other's skill sets to like be like, well, Nate's really good at doing this, so he's going to focus on this part of the sculpture and I'll focus on this. And it has actually worked out really well. This is a piece that is titled Lavatorium. A lot of our works take and draw from Latin language, just maybe a play on being like, well, this is what it is. It's a bathroom.
Yeah.
And in Latin, the word is lavatorium. According to Google, sometimes you put it in and it gives you a different word, but we're sticking with lavatorium.
So, there's also the concept in science of binomial nomenclature, which is like how you name animals in biology. You basically have like a pretty simple system for saying what the thing is, and it's really great because it doesn't, you don't have to have a million different ways to express one concept. You're just like, well, this is what it is. It's these two Latin names that, every species has their set. And so we sort of play off of that and kind of gives us an easy way to name our work. We just, what is it? Well, lavatorium is a bathroom. Throw that in Latin, and then
this one is like aspergillium, which is like mirror, and one of them is a shower. And so like, again, like the play on words. So a lot of times I think curators or people think we're being super clever, and it's like, we're not.
Well, I wouldn't say that.
We are
Just
clever,
maybe not.
but we're just like, so like when I label the box, it's like shower piece.
Yeah.
But when I send out the label, it's a little bit more fun. So this is like also using reclaimed and then also reworked material. So some of it is from my artwork and some of it is these really beautiful tiles we took out of a salvage tile yard up at Seneca Tile Company in Attica, Ohio.
Yeah.
And so trying to, again, one thing that is a thread throughout our work is like reusing, repurposing, a little bit of sustainability, just kind of thinking about our own impact. Like we do buy new materials and we do buy things. Like I definitely have to get new material, but if I can reuse something, if we can like repurpose something, it's our main goal. Nate actually turned all of the pieces and fabricated the components. Oh, unfortunately I took that picture out, but there's like this little part right here is like very carefully identical to the sliding handlebar of the shower that we installed.
And I think one other interesting thing about this whole installation is it's based off of the layout of our bathroom, which we renovated. And just in terms of like repurposing, kind of one of the things that we did was, because that was like a major creative endeavor, I would say, and that took up a pretty substantial chunk of our life while we were working on it. We wanted to not waste those creative choices, you might say. So we then took many of the a lot of the composition of our of that bathroom, a lot of the layout decisions that we made, and then sort of abstracted them or reinterpreted them into artwork. So
it's almost like we unfurled it. Like it's almost the exact same layout that it was. It's just like unrolled.
Yeah.
Because it was only it was a very small space. It was like 5 foot by 6 foot like bathroom. And then like here it looks huge, but it's like, oh, it's just because I unrolled it.
Yeah.
So, but I do think there was something about like we were building this installation and also the fabricating the bathroom at the same time as like COVID was happening. And so there was this like washing the hands, washing your body, and the bathroom was actually this space where it was like we are cleaning ourselves, and it's a space that every person uses the bathroom. Like
can't get much more universal.
And so this idea that the space is like so important to being healthy and clean and having that moment of like cleansing yourself is like actually a big part of this. And, you know, I was also potty training 2 children. So it was like I spent a lot of time in the bathroom. And then the worst part was I'd wash my hands because I just done something, then they would go to the bathroom and then I'd wash my hands again and they'd be like, oh man, no, I have to go to the bathroom. So definitely need a piece about washing hands in the future. But there was something interesting. This is where the beads actually first came into play mostly, is that we use them as like the shower feeling. And what's so interesting is they seem so active in this basin of the bathtub, and yet they're static, like they're not actually moving. And so there was this interesting play of like stillness and movement happening, like the way your brain is registering it. And it was really beautiful. So, and this is the final piece, which was, we had this kind of banana leaf wallpaper. It's actually, I think, Bird of Paradise, but
Yeah.
anyway, I kind of made this 3-dimensional wallpaper version, and that's a theme that also now continues in our work. So we then did a proposal for Momentum Intersection, which is a really interesting opportunity through the Toledo Arts Commission, where they partner with NSG Glass, which is also known as Pilkington Glass, which is a flat glass manufacturing company similar to like Corning or Pyrex. And we proposed using their material to create a vanity that would be later displayed in the Toledo Museum of Arts in their glass pavilion. And so this is kind of, these are materials from our proposal to them. And then we also made a sample, or I mean, we actually made an artwork, but using their materials, we made like a small scale version of what we wanted to really manifest. And so practicing laminating the water jet, cutting the glass, laminating together, and then decorating it with this like overabundance of embellishment. Again, thinking about that abundant culture, this like maximalist spending and living situation, adornment. And this is the way the final piece looked in the Toledo Museum of Glass Pavilion. Toledo Museum of Art Glass Pavilion. And it's interesting because it's in this very glassy place. It's a semi-transparent form. And it is actually full scale, like it is the same size as a traditional vanity. And functional, the drawers function. And so this was probably one of the more challenging pieces we've ever made together. Nate learned a lot about glass, and I learned a lot about gluing.
Yeah.
So, and I think that like for us, there was not only this play on like, again, nostalgia and also thinking about objects. We had just moved from Columbus to Cincinnati. And so furniture at that point takes on a very different meaning when you're moving, especially when you're moving more than like within the same city. And so there was this interesting hold that like we feel belonging suddenly had on you. It's like, I was almost like, I feel like my belongings own me as much as they own, as much as we own them. And so like trying to figure out what you would keep or discard. And there was something about the older furniture that seemed harder to get rid of, even though it was like sometimes degrading or the veneers are delaminating. And so we really paid homage to that kind of era with this specific piece. And then we also were thinking a lot about technology with screens, like people, the vanity of, and like looking at yourself in Zoom, like even as I'm doing right now, like watching like that screen reflection back and forth, like seeing yourself, but not quite seeing yourself. So this like semi-transparent state.
And one of the really interesting things about the glass that we use is it's partially mirrored. So not only like are you reflected in the glass, but you see through it as well. So it's like very apt to the like act of like sort of partially staring at yourself all the time on your screen while also trying to communicate or see through or like pay attention to what is happening during a presentation just like this one. So
yeah. So, and then we also really played up some of those curves with like the AI kind of thinking there, but maybe we're getting a little too much. We're gonna move on. So the next iteration of this project, we actually created a space for it to exist in. And so this has this curvature and actually is the exact same paint and trim color of our
bedroom at
home,
home.
our
Yeah.
bedroom at home. And so what's interesting is like this kind of bringing in the domestic space into the gallery. And then also the wallpaper behind it. Instead of using commercial wallpapers that we were repurposing or altering, we actually created our own wallpaper using images and illustrations from different parts of our garden. So I have a pretty extensive garden, and it has a combination of native and plants, but also a lot of vegetables. And so I let things go to seed, and you see these really beautiful flowers that like actually you don't normally see or think about with these plants. And so we were taking pictures of things like the bok choy, the carrots, and there's this flower called borage that you can eat the flower. I don't recommend planting that actually because it's everywhere.
Very aggressive.
But it is pretty. And then we were kind of playing with that theme in the wallpaper. So let's see here. Unfortunately, when you make semi-transparent like artworks, they're really hard to photograph. So this is another sculpture, again, playing with that dimensional wallpaper at this point. This is called Avum Axiom Lux, I think.
Yeah, I think so.
And
it means
grandmother's light. So this chandelier is actually from my grandmother's condo in Florida, and she drove it up to me on a she took it with her on the Amish bus. This is a very interesting family story. So my grandmother turned 90, and she was very jazzed about this because there's an Amish community in Sarasota, Florida, and a Mennonite community. And then there's also a similar community in Columbus. And for some reason, there was a bus that would drive straight through from that community all the way up to Ohio. And so she was so excited that when she turned 90, she was allowed to take the bus for free.
Yeah.
And so I actually saw my grandmother more frequently after she turned 90 because of this. And she would just, my aunt would put her on the bus, and then grandma would appear the next day, and the bus driver had always taken really good care of her. But one time she shows up with this bin, and she's decided that I have to have this chandelier in my wedding, which we got married in our backyard.
And we did have the chandelier.
And we did have the chandelier in the middle of the tent. And so this is actually very interesting because I've added pieces to the chandelier to kind of restore it in some ways, because it's obviously been on a journey. And then we also incorporated kind of this idea of the beads tying things together. And then the wallpaper just kind of reminds me of her house. She had this pothos plant that was like running throughout the lanai and like had that wasn't anywhere you'd ever seen. That was in an old place, but like basically this idea of this plant kind of growing out of the wall. So and it has a lot of none of the things are actually to scale. Like it is a play on imagination and memory and dreaming, and so there's a lot going on there as far as that. And then seeing the light come through the pieces is really interesting, how it plays on the wall and kind of this fracture and fracturing occurring. Then we kind of continued to work with
so basically continuing to work with some of our favorite materials here, wallpaper, glass. This piece is interesting because it's we basically took a wallpaper that was present in our home and edited it to like basically increase the number of blooms and blossoms and make it a little bit more collagey and chaotic. But then we placed another sheet of that partially mirrored glass over top of it. So depending on where you stand, you're either seeing a reflection of the room or of yourself, but if you stand so that the mirror is in shadow, you can see straight through it to the wallpaper on the other side. And then we're also, interested in sort of playing with these sort of domestic forms. So this does take on something of like a niche or a shelf or something that could theoretically be used. almost like could be like an ofrenda too. And then really arted it up with some kind of ghastly, but also, um, bejeweled and sort of shiny textures underneath. I think that's sort of a commentary on self-reflection, and the sort of maybe undercurrents of that.
Well, you keep working on
Yeah.
it. So there's just a lot of you helped me with this actually. I
Mhm.
carefully rhinestoned the underside of this shelf. So it's like if you look under, you get like a little surprise, which I do think is like something that we like to play with a bit in our work, where it's like you're rewarded if you stick with it a little bit longer,
Mhm.
just because we know that people tend to pass through artwork quickly. Oh, this is a fun piece. So again, thinking about objects and ownership and what we keep and what we discard, we actually went to a warehouse, and found these amazing chairs, and you can kind of talk about.
Yeah, so they were, in a state of disrepair, not really functional. So we took them home and cut them up and created this sort of reflecting pool effect of two chair backs being seamed together and reflecting each other. There's sort of a upper and lower area, and then we worked into it with beadwork and textiles, just trying to create, like, again, that sense of abundance but in a way that might be a little bit sinister almost at times. There's like it profligates, but it's sort of an out of control, like abundance or multiplication.
It's also maybe a little bit of a play off of like mildew. Like, I don't know, like there's this weird moment where you're like mold and mildew are actually really beautiful,
Yeah.
but obviously we know they're not good for us.
It gets
So,
very fungal.
although I guess, mold has to break things down
Yeah.
and stuff. But there's like this kind of play on that like visual, but made physical using the beads and the yo-yos and the fabric and things like that. And this is using a lot of materials that are left over from other craft projects. Like I've made Little Mermaid costumes and like stuff for the girls out of some of this material, and then carefully using the leftover bits to make the yo-yos because they use such a small amount. And then the beading is also very interesting just because I wasn't actually able to have the time to physically dedicate to carefully beating these things. And so it's almost like this, like, if you look very closely at them, there's like this chaos of like almost like how the crab, remember those videos where the crab was like gathering all and decorating
The
itself?
decorator crab.
It really looks like that. So it's like this like massing together of the beads. And then I would say probably for the any curator or gallerist who's like dealing with this piece is like, why is all this stuff falling off? And I was like, it's shedding. I don't know. So, but it is kind of supposed to do that because I think that furniture does weird things. So, we also then have this alien piece that we made that I love dearly. This is the stuffy chair, which has a Latin name associated with it. Where we've carefully repaired elements of it and then also like reconstructed it so that it has a new purpose. It was originally a buffet. And then
Yeah, it turns out that you can turn a buffet into a chair with pretty minimal intervention, which is something I've been thinking about and wanting to do for a long time. And then, more than just making an additional piece of furniture, we're always looking to create something that's sculptural as well. So we were thinking a lot about, our kids' sort of excessive spreading out of all of their stuff and their lives all over every part of our house. And noticing particularly like, certain couches and seating areas and chairs and things that just became covered with piles of stuff that they sort of discard, or they, leave on the floor somewhere, and we pick it up and just throw it on the chair, and temporarily you think, but of course it ends up being like sort of a permanent installation. So we wanted to honor that and then make it a little bit more functional too. So this is you can actually sit in this, it's fairly comfortable.
Yeah, it's actually pretty comfy. Turns out stuffed animals, when you lump them together, just become
Becomes a big cushion.
a big cushion. So everybody asks if these are our children's stuffed animals, and they are not. We tried,
They are
but
secondhand stuffed animals.
yeah,
But yeah.
and even the secondhand stuffed animals were like pillaged by the children to find the ones
get
that
the
I
best
could not
ones.
staple to the chair. So
Yeah.
but we've also, so this is another piece, we'll start to move a little quicker, but
Yeah.
this one is like playing off of like the landscape, but also headboards and bed frames and things like that. And so we've kind of reworked this. There is actually a rhinestone kind of
Border,
amber
yeah.
border, and then also a pinstripe of flocked green felt along the edge. And so kind of this play between very subtle dimension on flat surfaces. This is,
Yeah, so this piece is actually interestingly sort of born of our tendency to recycle things. We had a piece from the previous installation that was degrading as plastic tends to do over time. But the framework that it was built around was perfectly reusable. So it was upcycled into this entirely new thing, which basically serves as a, I don't know, I was kind of thinking about like Cabinet of Curiosities when I made this, and had some of the kind of nautical theme of some of the glass work that we've talked about before, as far as like coral reefs and small invertebrates and things like that. So this kind of became like a display case for some of these small pieces, and also like an experiment in some different techniques doing inlays and stuff like that.
yeah, and I think that like this piece in particular plays with like this kind of it was similar to the vanity piece and like this like imagination of what furniture could be like, but semi-functional. So
Yeah.
I don't know if like I don't, when I look at it, which I don't think Nate appreciates, but I'm going to share anyway, is like, it reminds me of the character from Beauty and the Beast, the little clock. And like,
Oh yeah.
because there's a lot of like similar like design elements to that, like his shape. And I was like, did you guys like, did you just watch Beauty and the Beast with the kids before you drew this up? Like, what's going
Maybe.
on? But I do think, but then actually so these poles are actually from a bed frame that Nate found that is identical to a bed frame that was at his grandparents' house. And so again, there's like really trying to think of elements from our own lives that we can kind of pull in and feed into the artwork that are meaningful. This particular piece is again repurposing some prior works and also materials, like as I had printed out different wallpaper to use in other pieces, then we were able to kind of cycle things together and reuse some beads. The under part of this actually has like almost like a vacuum formed fish situation. So there's like above and below landscape occurring here. Oh, I do have a close up of it. So there's anyway, so really starting to get some dimension and things kind of popping out there. Here is a detail shot of the vanity. And then this is kind of us working a little bit in the studio. Athena does not fit into this piece anymore. So
yeah,
but she is and this is us actually a time lapse of us making and filling in the little embellishments of the cabinet with resin and mica. And so there's like a little bit of a shimmer to those inclusions, the inlay.
And the pattern there is actually another wallpaper that we devised that is actually based off of the one of Molly's glass installations. Yeah.
Yeah. Down here, we started to add color to the vacuum form pieces. And so this is us kind of surveying and working in the studio during that time. So I got it down here. So now we're to the pieces that we currently have. And so
At the Rife Gallery.
At the Rife Gallery. So Fauna Revisited is actually based off of this artwork that we did actually have outside at the Nature Center. And one of the reasons that we feel like this piece really actually relates well to Sue's work is like she had a lot of gathering and inclusion and reworking of materials. And this piece in particular, the background actually utilizes found our glass from a factory in Kokomo, Indiana. And so here you can see us laying out the composition for the oculus that has the light shining through it. And I utilized two sandcast forms that are kind of playing off of how we do the vacuum forming. So I did that in sand and then poured molten glass into it. And then I was able to finish those pieces to then use in this. What's nice is the as we work together to layer the composition, like we're kind of thinking about how light passes through, but also the play of the colors and like bringing in a little bit of this like meditative moment, whether it's through nature or how we might be in a cathedral or a church or just this kind of the stained glass elements.
Yeah, and I think that even though we're using a static medium, we're using resin and glass, there is an element of movement involved in this work. When it's outside, it functions as sort of I guess you could say as like a sundial. It changes over the course of the day. The shadows change, the light changes inside the oculus. So I feel like that's, relevant as well to Sue's work and the sort of diaphanous like shifting of it.
Yeah. One thing we were like, especially like we didn't want it to seem like it was like a tombstone, which was one of my concerns. So like we did go in and like try to using some techniques that we've done with other works, like incorporate some color a little bit to, again, draw from the oculus into the rest of the form. And so here you can see Nate and I are actually lime washing the outside of it with these kind of pastel colors that we then kind of antiqued it and kind of did a little bit of a reveal of the texture underneath. And so this was us as we're preparing to like move it from an outdoor space to an indoor space to make that work for the piece. And I think that it's really interesting to see it in the gallery space because it is such a large piece. It's here are some of the sand castings from the wall. And you can kind of see that they're when you have light on them in certain ways and when you see them in a specific setting, they glow. And so like certain parts are then highlighted depending on where you're standing. And this again is kind of that seek and find, like you're rewarded if you can look at the piece longer. Like, it's not just, it's like that. It's similar to being in nature. Like the longer you look and observe, like the more you will find and see and be kind of engaged with and fascinated by. And so I think that that's something we really do push a lot with the work. And so having these pieces together in that space. And so you kind of have this big overwhelming piece with a lot of, I think probably more clear inclusions of what's going on. And then you have the more subtle glasswork along the other wall to kind of look at and engage with and think about the way that the light is reflecting through it and things like that. So
Yeah.
Any other parts?
I don't think so.
Cool. Well, we have 11 minutes.
Perfect. Great, folks. So something that kept coming up for me, and folks, if you have any questions, pop them into the chat and I will make sure to read them out. A couple of things that popped out to me that I would love for you to expand upon a little bit is your color palette. So you have some, like specifically in this piece on the left, there's a color palette that harkens a little bit to the styrofoam, but it harkens to other things too. And I know that it's very intentional. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so the thing that we're really interested in with the sort of the styrofoam and the silicone and other sort of material that is meant to be used in art or in home building, but is not meant to be featured as a material itself, is that is often assigned these colors Sometimes they're arbitrary, but they're basically designed so that you can distinguish like one product from another, right? Because otherwise it all just kind of looks the same. Because if they weren't colored, they would just be gray. So they actually artificially add this color to a lot of them. So it's really an afterthought. It doesn't serve any function other than to differentiate one product from another. But actually, a lot of times it's really lovely. And so one thing that we find really rewarding is to kind of stumble upon these colors rather than being like, having to conceive of and mix and like do all that stuff. We're like, well, similar to nature. I mean, this is the environment that we live in. Our environment is full of all these colors. So we're drawing our color palette from that, right? From these sort of arbitrary choices that were made by, chemists or industrial designers in, some faraway office somewhere to, for non-aesthetic reasons. So that I think is just for me really interesting things that are accidentally actually really compelling and interesting looking.
I do also think like what's interesting for me, like the joke is like coastal grandma. So my grandmother had a cow. A lot of stuff goes back to my grandmother because I think she was very formative for me, but she had this couch that had actually all the same colors as the piece Fauna Revisited has. And we've actually have used those colors in our house in like lime washing one of the walls. But what I do think is interesting is that like the colors of the construction materials are basically kind of like more chromatic versions of everything that was in the couch fabric. And so it's like this weird thing because, this like juxtaposition of two colors that don't really quite go together is the exact same thing that happens in these renovation projects where like you're not quite noticing or like, if you go to a place like somewhere in Florida, like the like putting together and opposing color palettes in this like muted color scheme is actually really beautiful and invited and the color blocking is there, and yet in the Midwest we hide all of that under bricks and siding.
Yeah.
So it's just like it's kind of fun play on like what we want to reveal or not reveal, but I do think that like the like harnessing of color palettes that we don't traditionally see or engage with, or maybe are coming back into popularity because like I know that couch like totally dates a time period and yet it's something that I can't like get out of my mind. So anyway.
Another thing that I'm really curious for you all to chat a little bit more about is that your work is really full of discovery and curiosity. And so I would love for you to chat a little bit about the importance of those things, like maybe play, in your practice.
Yeah, so I think that there's a couple of reasons that is so become so prominent. I think one is of course having kids and that they are, kind of fascinated by finding stuff or the sort of like poring over like Where's Waldo books or like finding acorns when they're walking outside or something like that. I think the other thing is like really like I think it's important for me that our work uh, on from several different vantage points, I guess you could say. So I always want to make something that will look interesting from far away, and then from closer, and then you can also get really close to it, and so that is where the sort of tiny details really pay off. So you can get in there and you can sort of get lost in like a very small section of the work because there's a lot of rich detail. And the easiest way for us to, or maybe not the easiest, but the best way for us to achieve that is by amassing all of the kind of stuff that we have, the kid stuff, the beads, the rhinestones, the tiny little, plastic toys, and then just sort of like, when you vacuum form them, you sort of create this almost like a relief carving that features all those little things.
Yeah, I also do think like we play with like imagery and subject matter and things like that, but I think we also just really love investigating materials. And so um I was told like in undergrad, like, not to be a jack of all trades and a master of none, but it's like, I don't know. I think like there's so many things to be curious about. And so I do think there are some people who get really, really skilled at like developing like a specific technique and doing that. And I think that what Nate and I are both really good at is being comfortable with learning new things and taking risks and like experimenting. And I think that the curiosity of wanting to understand a new material or a new way of working with something or trying something new is like more important to us than and keeps us engaged in the practice. Like we both have other things that we do to earn money, and like I would say that my income portfolio is probably a little bit more related to like focusing on getting commissions for what we do and like getting grants and things like that. But a good section of it is still related to teaching and writing and things like that. And so it is interesting to think that like this opportunity to play has like with the artwork and the material is what also keeps us engaged as makers. So, and I like if you think about the state of like when you're making artwork, you do want to get kind of into a state of flow. So like your body does need to learn the material and start to function with it. But I don't know. I think curiosity is a big part of
Yeah.
it. Like we're both curious people. We like to know how things work. And so I think that shows up a lot.
Absolutely. And I think my last question will be, clearly you all work well together. I'm curious if you have tips or just theory thinking on how best to create collaboratively. There are plenty of the people that do it that don't have an extended relationship, right? So you all have the addition of knowing each other really deeply in your relationship. But there's something to it, like to join your practice in the way that you do. How do you ensure that is a good experience for both of you?
Well, I mean, I definitely think it forces us to have a lot of dialogue. And that's very obviously super important. I think the other thing is just like learning to gauge when the other person is really committed to part of the idea and having the like grace to back away when that person is like really on fire about something, unless it's a terrible idea. And then, but that doesn't happen very often. I mean, I think our aesthetic is well aligned enough that it's like for the most part, like if somebody is really, really into something, like we will, the other person will respect that, and then, or at least try to like, gently nudge if that is like something that needs to be changed. So I think that's really important. We did set up when we initially did this because we had no experience with collaborating. We did have fairly strict rules for it. And those have just like kind of gone by the wayside as we've become like more skilled at collaboration. And those were like basically the important thing about that is, as we mentioned before, we were passing things back and forth, but every person had, what is it, 2 vetoes like per piece where you could be like, no, don't do that, or something like that. And so that actually worked out pretty well. Most of the time we didn't really have to do that, but I think that helped to develop a sense of like what the other person's like hard line was. Like, we don't want this work to be about that. We don't want to like involve that. So yeah, I mean, I think starting with like specific ground rules is really important, and then use that to like build up your tolerance for collaboration.
Yeah, I think like the communication aspect is really important. And then I also think that Nate and I were also old enough. I mean, I hate to be like old enough, but like we had reached a certain level with our careers where like we didn't take criticism of artwork quite as personal, I think, as when we were younger in our careers. And so like if And also we were better at delivering criticism too. So it was like, well, if I don't really like something that's happening within the piece, I know how to talk to him about it in such a way that like it'll work the way, or maybe like he doesn't like what I'm doing. He knows what to say to me to get it to potentially be a conversation instead of an argument. Um, there's also like a little bit of a joke that like we're both middle children, and so like we have had to deal with compromise a lot. And so even though we're both actually very assertive individuals, we're like also like malleable in some way and understand like to get what we want accomplished, we have to be flexible. So and I do think there is a little bit of like, luckily we do kind of consider this just like a like part of our lives. And so like, we don't actually, we spend a lot of time making them work, like definitely as like we get closer to exhibition deadlines and things like that, like we are spending many, many, many hours on this, but a lot of it is actually talking to each other like weeks in advance and like planning out and like kind of thinking through things. And then as we actually start to work with material, we both know that there will be adjustments to the plan. One thing that I have found really interesting is like we create a lot of sketches and drawings and stuff before we make the larger installations now. And I have been kind of surprised how much the final artwork actually does look like the original sketch. When I'm just like, whoa, everything went wrong. Like, we didn't actually do half of what we talked about, but it still looks like it. So that's good for us, I guess, if we
Yeah, I
get
think
more
that's
public commissions.
yeah.
So, but I do think as far as working together, like if I were to give people tips, it would be to kind of really set out some rules for like, what is the conversation when we don't agree? Because that's like the real tipping point is like, if everything's working out fine, like it doesn't really matter, but there will be moments where you don't agree and you have to figure out how to get through that.
Wonderful. I think that's a perfect place for us to leave it. Molly, Nate, thank you again so much for your generosity of time and talent. Thank you all for joining us for this artist talk by collaborative artist Molly Jo Burke and Nathan Gorgen as a part of our programming series for A Common Thread. I'd like to give a special thank you to the curators as well as the other participating artists, the Ohio Arts Council's board, the Ohio legislature, and the governor who support the Ohio Arts Council, this great space, and of course, Ohio artists. Thanks everyone, and have a great day.